interesting that you go through the book with a lot of experiences. One of them, the quote from Brett Stevens about the CAT scan. I was like, oh, I was in the room when he said that.
We were together
at the LaFell conference.
That's right.
And so it's interesting that as people tell us stories through the years, it's awesome. It's amazing that you then be able to share that with larger audiences. And so what was your plan then once you say, okay, this is post 10/7, as you're writing then, who is the audience, or who was the audience, and then I guess who is the audience today?
Right. So I woke up on 10/7, and I guarantee you I have a very similar story as Rabbi Sherman and Rabbi Guzik, who I'm lucky to call friends and colleagues. It's amazing. I think we all take it for granted that we travel on Los Angeles and we have one of the most impressive group of Zionist rabbis around the Los Angeles area. It is not something that we should take for granted. As I travel around the country and hold these book talks, it's not the case. Sometimes I get, put in one synagogue versus the other because this synagogue is pro-Israel, this synagogue is less pro-Israel. In LA, the question is, who can be the most pro-Israel, right? And it's a very
tied. Actually, 5th grade Sinai Akiba played VBS today, and it was a tie. It was perfect.
There you go. Perfect. So here we are. So I woke up on 10/7, just like you, just like many of our colleagues, and the calls and the text messages and the WhatsApp groups, they all started to flood in. It felt very different, and many have heard this story before about how we have personal connection to one of the hostages, and Hirsch's parents texted us. And everyone was concerned about where everybody was. Nobody found anybody, but nobody knew that people were taken captive yet. We went to synagogue, and we were all mistaken. I thought that there was an attack by Hamas on the border communities of the state of Israel. That is not what happened on 10/7. 10/7 triggered a global war by a large conglomerate jihadist movement all around the world against Jews everywhere. And that's a very different understanding. And I feel like as I talk about in the book, I mean, you're far more courteous and polite than I am. I was raised in Chicago. So it's nice to say that Jews live everywhere. And all Jews are important because Jews live in Canada and Britain and France and Australia. Basically, more than 90% of Jewish population around the world is in two places, in Israel and the United States. If American Jews don't understand what's happening and react quickly, then basically global diaspora is in trouble. Okay, so as important as it is that French Jews respond to the threats that are in France, it is for French Jews, but not for global Jewry, because the fate of global Jewry doesn't rest in Paris. The fate of global Jewry does rest in the way that we respond to Columbia, UCLA, campuses around the country, marches that go on through Midtown Manhattan. I mean, this was the shocking part, is that those protests began before Israel had even responded to the massacre of 10/7. So how could there be a protest against Israel when all Israel had done was suffer massacre, rape, and beheadings?
That's what Dan Senor says in the October 8th film to begin, that the day that he thought people would have sympathy or empathy for those who were slaughtered actually was empathy to those who slaughtered.
Right, that's exactly right. And so it was an inversion of morality, right? It was a complete moral bankruptcy, as I reference a bunch of times in the book. And that led me to understand that the messaging to American Jews is crucial at this moment. And American Jews have to start behaving differently. We have to understand that we're part of the war just as much as those kids who are entering the Gaza Strip once again in the second or third phase of the war, however you want to understand this. I've been fortunate enough to travel to Israel 5 times since October 7th. And every time I sit with soldiers, and when you talk to them, they believe that they are in a profound way, fighting not just for the border communities of Israel, right, but for the future of the Jewish people everywhere. Mm-hmm. And I think they're right. Mm-hmm. And I think that we here have to fight as well, a different type of fight, and it's incumbent on us to win.
I didn't understand that point until the UCLA encampments hit and my cousin was in Rafah saying, "Are you okay?" I was like, "What do you mean, am I okay? I'm here surrounded by security." He said, "No, I'm watching on TV. Are you okay?" Right. And I was just in Israel last week, and he, on his phone, showed me pictures of tunnels that were big enough for RVs to get through. Right. And yeah, that absolutely. And so I want to go into sort of what you said, because what's happening here, you write in the early parts of the book, Tikkun Olam Judaism, more universalist Judaism, social justice, and I use those words in a broad sense, versus the particular, like, I care about who I am. Maybe describe that sort of contradiction where the Jewish world was pre-10/7 and where you believe, based on the dual loyalty, we should be going as a Jewish community. Not giving up Tikkun Olam, but how that perhaps term was hijacked a bit.
Right. So I'm only smiling because this is the major point that all of my colleagues like to, especially, they like to hone in on this point of the book. If there's a pie chart of Judaism, if we all imagine a pie chart, well, let's start here. Basically, in the history of American Judaism, American Jews, basically since 1967, have all been Zionist. And now we have a subset of that population, mostly between the ages, let's say, of 20 and 32. I'll give it, to make it even larger, 20 and 35, that don't support Israel in the same way as every other group of American Jews. So first of all, unlike most Jewish leaders, I think that we have to take a step back and wonder, how did we go wrong? Not what's wrong with them. We must have done something to create a different perspective.
And they even asked that question of, you lied to us.
Right. So no other group has ever said that you lied to us. Exactly. Right? No other group has ever turned around and said, let's burn Ramah to the ground because we were not raised correctly. Here we are, we have this situation. So I think that we have to look at ourselves and say, well, what was the messaging that they received growing up that led them to this outlook, to this perspective? And I believe, since I was older, I think I started to get this messaging as a beta concept, is that Jewish history is over. We're in a new kind of utopia, euphoric state where we're absolute equals as everybody else. And because of it, we don't need to focus on solely being Jews and taking care of each other. We can focus on a kind of universalist message of social justice for all. And in that way, Judaism becomes A, easier, much easier, right? And B, it means that the bar for being Jewish and Jewish education becomes much more accomplishable for our institutions. Because if the field trip stops going to the Holocaust Museum and starts going to the food bank, then the kids can stand at the food bank and feed the hungry and feed the homeless, and they feel like they have accomplished the mission of the Torah. And our teachers and our administrators feel like they've done something great too. The problem is that when you look at the pie chart of Judaism, as Tikkun Olam, this universalist view got larger and larger and larger, other things had to shrink in order to accommodate that. And so what I'm arguing for in the book isn't necessarily just a dual loyalty to the United States and Israel. I think Israel is the outcome of a dual loyalty to the United States, to the place we are, and to our peoplehood, to Jews everywhere. This idea that we actually carry the responsibility of helping Jews, or nobody else will. And I think that people who have examined the last year and a half, and I'm talking about even when I talk to youngsters in high school and junior high school, it's totally apparent to them. I mean, I think that I think that universities are in for a wonderful awakening when this generation of Jews shows up. Yep. Because they're not, I like to ask, not 3 days, 4 days, a week into the encampment, 2 weeks in the encampment, what should our kids have done? The very first kid who was told at UCLA, you're not allowed to walk up these steps into the library. If that kid had said, get the hell out of my way, would it have been different? If we had raised our kids to react like that from the gut, from the outset, would it have been different? If that kid had been expecting it, if that student had anticipated that this might happen. None of us anticipated that this would happen. And it feels like the wool was over our eyes because it feels like this was planned for years and years and years by people who were great strategists. And we think of ourselves as pretty smart people. So what do we need to do for the next group that's going to encounter this at UCLA and Columbia and Harvard and all these other places around the country that we want to send our kids to because of the addiction that we carry as a people, right? To these kinds of institutions of higher learning. How do we raise them differently? And I argue that the pie chart of Jewish values has to change significantly in order for their Jewish neshamas to reflect that change.
I mean, just 2 weeks ago, a student here who's at UCLA, would like to apply to a graduate program at UCLA, called me, Rabbi, I have a question. Yeah, what's going on? He said, I've been advised to not say that I'm Jewish or share a Jewish identity story on my graduate school application. He's like, but Rabbi, they can find me online. Like I'm pretty vocal on campus. And I sort of asked him the same question actually Rabbi Wolpe asked a student at Harvard Divinity School when they were not allowed in because they said they were Jewish, and the person, I believe, that was looking at applications said, oh, they're Zionists, so they must be occupiers and colonialists. And he said, oh, can I help? Do I want to help you get in? And the student said, oh, I don't want to be at the place where I'm going to feel like that. And so I don't know if it's fair for us to, have to prepare our students to say, get out of here. And so I guess the dual loyalty piece, especially in the universities, and obviously it's changed in the last weeks and the last days, based on this aspect, do we withdraw? Because now I see, you know what? Jews, and you even write about this, Jews created their own institutions, and then people came back to us. Is it time to do that again? Or do we go in and say, you know what? I mean, it's so sad to me that Columbia University is a closed campus where you have to show an ID, where when I was there, I could bring all my friends and walk through College Walk. How does that fit into the college campus right now?
So so in this case, I don't think that the situation is quite as dire as we make it out to be in terms of university life. It's dire when it comes to the specific universities that we have always aspired for our children to attend. Meaning to say, it's pretty awful if the only universities we want to send our kids to are Columbia, Harvard, MIT, UCLA. But there are actually thousands of universities in this country, thousands. And many are actually places that have celebrated and protected its Jewish populations. The question becomes, right, and I just had a conversation with Elliot Cosgrove about this, right? So if high school seniors at Park Avenue and high school students at VBS and high school students at Sinai, I'm betting, all dream of going to UT Austin, then something has changed in this country. Yep. And our kids are smart enough to realize it. Our kids are smart enough to realize it. The question is, are their parents smart enough to realize it? Right? Can they adjust their expectations to understand that every Jewish high school student is now applying to UT Austin and Vanderbilt and Tulane and University of Florida and University of Miami and USC, and these schools are all located, except for USC, in very different areas of the country. And I'm not saying, red state, blue state, although there's a whole lot of redness in all of those states. What I'm saying is that there is a certain amount of moral clarity and protection that was provided to students on those campuses from the outset that weren't provided to campuses, if you look at the places that we aspired to go when we were in high school. And so when you say why wouldn't Jewish students aspire to be at Columbia or Northwestern or Berkeley or UCLA? There's an obvious answer, and they seem to get it better than their parents. And that's part of the process here that's unfolded. I actually have great optimism for the next chapter, because I feel like our kids always rise to the occasion. Whether it be in Israel or whether it be here, our kids know how to rise to the occasion. I feel like their parents sometimes are slower to come to that same realization because we've raised them clutching onto this expectation.
And you and I are speaking as parents of those children who are about to enter those spaces, which is both scary and also filled with optimism in terms of what we're seeing. Dual loyalty is not new. You sort of trace it going back to the Dreyfus affair in France. You should talk about Rashi. Maybe give us one of your sort of favorite examples that you see dual loyalty is not a new idea, but it is an idea that the Jews have been grappling with wherever they have lived, and how have they, I don't want to say overcome it, but actually been dual loyalists to their country.
So one of the surprising results of a book tour is to learn what audiences know and what audiences don't know. So this outcome...
Everybody get out your paper and pen.
Yeah. This outcome teaches me that most Jews don't know enough about our own history, especially modern history. So meaning to say, if I talk to you about the temple, Jews know about the Babylonians or the Romans, but when I talk about 19th century France as being one of the most important centuries of Jewish history, I basically lay out a paradigm in the book that starts with the beginning of 19th century France. So if you go to any university or any doctoral program and you take a class in European modern history, it's going to begin with the French Revolution, right? Which was the best intended revolution that ended in not so much liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? So a great emperor, not so much great in size, but stature, Napoleon, ends up taking over, and it ends up becoming basically a military dictatorship of sorts. But he has a reaction to the Jewish people that's completely different. And he says, should we extend rights to the Jewish people? Should Jews be considered citizens of France like every other citizen? And that sparks this debate all through Europe. All through Europe. Should Jews essentially be emancipated? And he does the logical thing, which is, if you don't know the answer, let's invite Jews into a conversation. So he invites this thing called the French Sanhedrin, 70 notables of France, led by Rabbi David Sinsheim. I feel so bad for Rabbi Sinsheim when I tell the story every time. I can't imagine being called to Napoleon's office and say, please assemble the 70 most notable Jewish people in France. Can you imagine whose mother called it? They were left off the list. It's a horrible, horrible, horrible situation for Rabbi Sinsheim. So he assembles this group, and they come and they meet with Napoleon. And Napoleon poses them all these questions. I'll give you the easiest one, right? How could Jews be loyal to France if at the end of one of your most iconic meals of the year, you all sit around the table and you say, next year in Jerusalem? That's weird. Explain that to me. And so Rabbi Sinsheim, through only Talmudic logic, tries to pull apart each question to explain when we can be loyal to France and when Jewish law takes precedent, and back and forth, and really tries to jump through hoops. The Ministry of Interior for France at the time says, why don't we call all the Jewish population to Paris and make them take an oath? That's maybe a good idea. And there's lots of different ideas that emanate from that period. But sure enough, what happens? We lose our window, and Napoleon loses power, and Jews are shoved back into the ghettos, and they're locked for a century because Europeans, they decide that Napoleon was nuts. They come to their senses. Jews should definitely not be citizens, and we're locked away. Almost a century later, that's 1806, 1807, in 1895, not far from where the French Sanhedrin met, Alfred Dreyfus is put on trial. And by kangaroo court, with very little evidence against him, he is declared guilty. And Dreyfus's instinct is exactly Rabbi Sinsheim's instinct. Dreyfus's instinct is, you say that I'm guilty, that I've betrayed you, that I'm not capable of being a loyal citizen. I say, long live France. I'll show my loyalty even after I've been betrayed. And there was one person standing there watching the trial, according to legend, right? Thank God, I relate to him a lot. He had tried screenwriting and it didn't work out, thank goodness. And he was watching, and he was a journalist, and his name was Theodor Herzl. And he said, why would Dreyfus say, long live France, after France spits in his face? We need to kind of reimagine this whole question of loyalty. It's time to reimagine this entire thing. And he says, we'll never prove our loyalty in this paradigm. It has to be a completely different one. And he goes off and he writes The Jewish State, the political treatise that changes the world forever, 1895. So what I'm saying here is that after October 7th, we can't be intimidated by the charge of dual loyalty. We have to now turn
either side of the aisle.
On either side. It's amazing. The far left and the far right don't agree on anything but their hatred of Jews.
And that was the slide, if you saw October 8th, that begins the film of putting that, I think he says, yeah, exactly, the horseshoe, right?
Horseshoe.
Right.
Right. So, let's talk about like, famous anti-Semites that I talk about in the book, not so that anybody should not leave here offended by something that I say, right? So you look at Elon Omer at one time or Marjorie Taylor Greene on the other, they come very close to saying almost the same exact thing about the Jewish people, right? That it's a conspiracy and that they were all in charge. And I only wish that all of their allegations were true, but they're not. But they're not. And so we get to this point where, well, how do we respond to these kinds of charges, especially when we find this provocative? And it shouldn't be provocative because this is the way that we all behave. Because on October 8th, good Jews woke up and said, what can I do to help Israel? But I take it one step further when I speak to audiences and I say it wasn't just good Jews. I thought it was only Jews. It was actually any decent American woke up and said, what can I do for Israel?
We didn't see that even in the faith world through all of our friends.
We didn't see that everywhere because you and I aren't connected everywhere. We're only connected locally here and through our own networks.
And even in those networks, it was
in those networks were very quiet, very quiet. So I was at a conference with Rabbi Sherman, and we were challenged by an evangelical pastor. We were challenged because he said that his kids would come defend our kids, and they would welcome our kids in their universities. But our kids and our families wouldn't welcome him and his kids in the same way because we don't treat evangelicals the same way that evangelicals treat Jews. And I thought to myself, I think he's right to a certain extent.
I remember he said, you might not love me, but I will keep loving you.
Right.
I'll never forget him.
Right.
And he's been here and we've traveled together. Yeah.
So I came back to LA and I thought to myself, well, maybe I should reach out. So I called a church that we both know, a pretty sizable church here in Los Angeles. And I said to them, why don't you come to VBS to have coffee with me? The senior pastor came down to VBS and we had coffee. And they explained to me all of the pro-Israel things that they've done since October 7th. Many of us drive by the church occasionally. It's called Bel Air Church. Okay? And following October 7th, they first brought in Patricia Heaton. Then they brought in IDF soldiers. Then they brought in hostage families. But they're not being brought in through the same mechanism that we bring in our synagogue speakers. And so I had no idea that these things were happening. And we began to partner. And our board and his elders went to the Nova exhibit together. And we began building relationship between VBS and Bel Air Church. And I argue that it has nothing to do with particular us being Jews. It has to do with these shared values as Americans. So I bring up the example in the book, right? At Harvard University, just to pick on Harvard for a little bit, I don't want to ask who's gone to Harvard and who hasn't gone to Harvard in this room, but I can tell always by who grimaces when I tell the story. At Harvard University, during one of the protests, the pinnacle was they came to the center of campus, they lowered the American flag, and they raised up the Palestinian one. Why do you have to lower the American flag in order to raise up the Palestinian one? Because Palestinianism is the inversion of Americanism. It stands for the exact opposite of every value that we stand for. The two cannot coexist. Not Israel and Palestinianism, not Zionism and Palestinianism. Americanism and Palestinianism cannot coexist.
You just define Palestinianism as opposed to Palestinian people.
It's the Palestinian people, right? Like Einat Wilf talks about
exactly.
Palestinianism in her writings, right? So we have Zionism. Zionism aspires to build Tel Aviv University and Hadassah Hospital and highways and roads and villages and cities and aspires to build Startup Nation and a stock exchange and all kinds of good stuff. And Palestinianism aspires to destroy Israel. Right? There is no plan to what to build, no aspirational goal of Palestinianism, and there's no reason for us to believe that there is some kind of hidden one that we have not heard yet. That's the stated goal. It's been the stated goal since 1947. We just haven't been willing to open our eyes to that idea. Einat Wilf deserves a lot of credit. Yep, so here we are, we're at this place, and we say to ourselves, well, that happened at Harvard. What is the opposite? Well, the opposite is what I talk about in the book, the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. Ole Miss, they approach the flag at the center of campus, and students from Ole Miss lock arms and stand around the flag and say, you will not lower the flag to raise up a Palestinian flag on this campus. And the police have to come because they're terrified of what's going to happen to the encampment protesters. Now what's going to happen to the students? The police come and separate it, and the American flag flies. I hate to break this to people, but there are far less Jews at Ole Miss than there are at Harvard University.
Yep.
So what they recognize at Ole Miss, as non-Jews, is that flag is an affront to their Americanism. They're not there to protect Jews. At Harvard, they're not there to protect Jews either. But at Harvard, they see no problem with the way that unfolded.
Context.
It's the
No, but like that in the film, and as we all know from last year,
Right.
each one of those presidents said, depending on the context, and they couldn't have the ability to say,
Right.
there's no context here, it's simply the hatred of, it's Jew hatred.
It's Jew hatred. That's what it was. It was Jew hatred.
So when I was,
But it was also America hatred.
yeah, no, I think that's interesting. So speaking of America hatred, Jew hatred, and then last question, then we'll open up the conversation. When I was staffing USY Pilgrimage for 3 summers, we would get up to the north in Kibbutz Hanaton, and we would have more time to discuss. And there was a little piece that I found that I would always ask the questions: are you a Jewish American or an American Jew? If it's the case for dual loyalty and they're both, then are we American Jews or are we Jewish Americans? I'm asking this not out of because I know, because I'm fascinated. How does this concept fit into what that looks like today, and has that changed from October 6th to what Daniel Hartman says, Genesis Jews to Exodus Jews?
So the way that so first of all, it's even on the front page of the book, right? The cover is American Jews. So I consider myself an American Jew. I encourage everybody else to consider themselves American Jews as well. Even if you are the most patriotic American possible, the double helix image that I create in the 3rd chapter, the thesis of the book, is that when Jacob is about to head out of Israel for the first time, he lays his head down, and he has a dream, and the dream is a ladder. And in the ladder, angels are going up and angels are coming down, and Rashi explains that the angels are actually participating in like a hockey shift, right, in a line shift. So the angels in Israel and the angels in diaspora are so different that as he's about to leave Israel, he needs a new line of angels to come protect him because he's going to be in a totally different place. That's how different we saw Israel and the diaspora in 10th or 11th century France, where Rashi was. I'm arguing that if you see those poles, those up and down poles, that the angels are coming up and down as connected through the rungs of the ladder, and you see that image of the rungs being able to climb up into the better future for Israel, Jacob. And if you understand in modernity that the ladder just twisted around, it becomes a strand of DNA, it becomes the Jewish double helix. That ladder image, just twirl it around and keep twirling it. The idea of Israel and diaspora, the connection between it has always existed since the time of Jacob leaving just to go a few miles over to his uncle, to now when we are across the world. And I'm trying to get Jews to come off the poles. By the way, Israeli Jews should come off the poles too, okay? So the only family that Israeli Jews have is us. That's it. That's all they got. The only family that we have is them. And so when they're in trouble, we have to be in the middle of the pole ready to help. And when we're in trouble, they have to be in the middle of the pole ready to help. And the only way we climb that ladder is together. So you could be American, but it's the rung that makes you Jewishly connected to peoplehood. And so I'm hoping that we all end up somewhere in the middle of that rung. And I argue that, even if you're, what does moving all the way over to one side look versus the other? That's for each of us to decide. But even if you are in the bottom rung, right? You're not yet Rabbi Sherman Zionism. You're just testing it out Zionism, okay? If you're just trial Zionism, just moving up 1 or 2 rungs is a success. For some of us, we might move 10 or 12 rungs up, but for even if it's just 1 rung up since October 7th, I think that'd be a huge success.
I lied. I have one more question, and it's actually like 2 in 1, because it's fascinating. First of all, American Jews, it's fascinating in Hebrew, Yehudi Amerikai. So the word American is before Jews, even though the Jew is actually the subject. Yeah, which is really interesting. Maybe just comment, and this is more of a breakfast conversation, but welcome to observe this, because I think we all struggle in terms of when, even if we don't agree with a policy in Israel, how we criticize Israel, or I like to say how we give constructive feedback publicly, I think is crucial, because the people watching and listening to people like you and me, as you said, don't have the expertise, knowledge, or clueless about what the actual issue is. How do you deal as a rabbi with this dual loyalty, but saying, but rabbi, look, this, or now in this country, that? Since this book came out, how has it been a guide for that? And I'm going to throw in the word anti-Zionism. Where does that tent where is that tent for you based on this?
So anti-Zionism is outside the tent, right? So
who defines it?
What is that?
Who defines it?
Who defines it? Well, they define it, right? Jews that walk into a Palestinian encampment for Passover Seder have defined themselves as outside of the Jewish community. I would argue that I have a particular view of the world because I was raised as a very startling experience. I was raised as a Cubs fan. Okay, so I came to Los Angeles, and now my kids are all Dodgers fans, right? And my dad is a Yankees fan, so we've moved further west over time. And we had this eye-opening experience. We went to Cooperstown and visited, and it's one of the great cathedrals in this country. If you're gonna visit, make a trip to Cooperstown. It's equally, it's equally sacred and inaccessible from anywhere you try to get to it. It's just perfectly put in the middle of nowhere.
That's where I grew up.
Yeah,
it was a day trip. It was the best.
Right. So here we are. We walk into Cooperstown, and I realize that the Cubs, this historic franchise, has had very little impact on baseball whatsoever. There's almost not a single picture of the Chicago Cubs up in the entire Cooperstown Museum. How could it be that this idea that I rooted for my entire life has almost no impact on the story of baseball? And when somebody takes an opinion outside the mainstream of Jewish world, right? When somebody thinks I should go into the encampment and participate in the Passover Seder, or we should keep funding Columbia because they'll change on their own. They're rooting for the Tigers, right? They're rooting for the Cubs or the Tigers or the Marlins. They're rooting for a team. I mean, even the Marlins have won a World Series. But I mean, they're rooting for a team of little consequence on the story of American Judaism. American Judaism is not going to be shaped by those views. And so when they take a step back and they espouse those views, they need to understand that they have every right to do so. Every right to do so in America. They should feel fortunate to be in America, as I do, and all of us should. And they're outside the boundaries of the Dodgers organization. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, very. So we'll open up to Q&A. I just want to say how fortunate I feel to have a think tank, and as you said earlier, with a lot of our colleagues in LA, when we just amazing collegiality, specifically around Israel and this idea of this U.S.-Israel relationship. BBS, Sinai, Adat Shalom. It's a very blessed family to be part of. Yes. So questions and for Rabbi Lebovitz. Yes, Norm. I'll repeat it for those online.
Yeah, one of the that grew up, especially after October 7th, was the education of Jewish children in Israel not knowing about the diaspora. And after the events here, I would voice the same concern, is that the Jews in America don't know about the diaspora. As your story about French Jews indicated, or the stories about that we hear in America. Do you believe that to be the case, that maybe we should focus also on diaspora Judaism, not just events like the Holocaust, but the way we live?
I couldn't agree more. So do you want to rephrase that question?
Yeah, so basically,
long
it's
question.
not just U.S.-Israel relations.
Those are special synagogue questions where
No,
the
but
question,
it's
6 paragraphs.
people to
yeah.
people that we don't really know each other. I just want to say one thing about that question. I was in Israel 2 weeks ago with the Voice of the People Council with President Herzog, and that was his mission to us, not only to come back loving our Jewish problems, but he said, please go know each other. And even in my own cohort, I had a young woman who was a doctor from Sweden, an Ethiopian Jew, a woman whose mother was Muslim and father was Jewish from Morocco. And what I realized was like my lived experience in this bubble, not only at Sinai, but LA and the United States, was a very different lived experience than like I'm dealing mostly with Christian-Jewish relations and getting churches on board. And this woman's like, I've never met a Christian in my life, but I can tell you all the Muslim people I work with that I want to talk about the Abrahamic Accords countries. So yes, and actually this morning, really interestingly, we used to say start with the college campus. Now it's start with the high school students. Right. This morning we had an amazing faculty meeting with our preschool teachers from a woman who works with Schechter Institute about how to teach Israel to early childhood, preschool, right. Just showing images and food and using your senses so that they can grow up actually knowing each other. Yeah.
So my working hypothesis, Norm, is that people reacted very differently if they had somebody that they knew in Israel on October 7th than if they didn't know anybody particular on October 7th. I saw that all throughout the synagogue. People who knew families that were affected, whether they suffered part of the death of destruction, whether they suffered the displacement, whether they suffered whatever it is. Personal relationships are so important for our people moving forward, especially for our youngest of people who value personal statements of lived experience at a much higher level than we do in our lives, right? We would trust a news outlet. They trust person-to-person lived experience much more. So I would start with the idea that Jews growing up in Los Angeles should know Jews in Israel. If you say to me, should Jews in Los Angeles know Jews in England? Of course. I think, of course, the answer. But I think the double helix that I see that we need to bring closer together, as I say, if we only have so much time and resource available to us, the question is, how do we bring American Jews and Israeli Jews closer together, which would bring, I think, the greatest benefit to the Jewish people at large. But personal relationships and lived experiences is crucial. It's not only Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews, it's the way in which Judaism gets taught in class. I'll give you an example. A head of school of a pretty esteemed private school here in Los Angeles came to me and said that the students in the school, her senior girls, learn the story of Anne Frank. And they talk about it at a higher level than when they learned it in elementary school. That's their senior project. What do I think about that in terms of relationship with Israel? And I said, I think it's no relationship with Israel. That's what I think it is. I think if you're asking the kids to fall in love with the empathy and the humanity of a girl who was murdered by Nazis who was Jewish, but if you read the diary, it doesn't have a lot to do with Judaism per se. I said, why don't you ask the girls to read a biography about Golda Meir? If you're looking for a woman that we should hold as a hero, that we should put out to our kids and say, this is a woman who lived this experience. Why don't we hold up somebody who made Aliyah from Milwaukee after coming out of everywhere she came out and rose up to be prime minister of the Jewish state? And there aren't a whole lot of women that we can hold in that prime minister's office. Why don't you use Golda Meir? And she said, I never thought of it like that. And I don't think that we should take for granted that other people think the way that we do. As a matter of fact, more and more I've learned over the 18 months since October 7th or 17 months that I think Jews are very unique in the way that we think about things. And we assume that everybody thinks like us. In reality, nobody thinks like us. Nobody thinks like us. And so when we're in the bubble fetching or debating or, dare I say, arguing, right, about what other people think of us and how we're behaving and what's going to be the outcome, and we have a very unique flavor to the way that we do that. And it's until I start going on and visiting people and having coffee with people and sitting down and asking them, you really don't learn what's going on outside of a room like this all over the country.
An answer to your question of how do we get the Israel and diaspora together. I'm the vice president of Torah Fund for the Pacific Southwest region of Women's League of Conservative Judaism. And this year's theme is Am Yisrael High.
Right.
And the first part of my Torah study program was to focus on learning.
Right.
And the second part of my program was to focus on the Am Yisrael High theme. And what we did, every region of the 13 regions of Women's League have 2 kahilot in Israel that we are assigned to. So what we did is we reached out to those 2 kahilot and had them as guests. And we composed questions for them because our big concern is Israel. And they composed questions for us. And the number one question was, how are you guys doing with all the anti-Semitism? And I was blown away that they were so concerned about us. At the same time, we were so concerned about them. So my suggestion is,
Give to Torah
if
Fund.
Men's Club doesn't have it, I beg your pardon?
Give to Torah Fund. That's your suggestion. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Something like that.
Right.
Synagogues could do something like that. Website and vote for conservative Masorti Judaism.
We're both on the slate.
Good.
What number?
Number 17. I don't know where. I don't know.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
You going to Israel?
I hope.
Oh, take my spot.
Always.
I'll be there.
May
Yeah,
4th,
Yitzhar Hess is coming to you too?
Yep.
Oh, wonderful. Yitzhar Hess, the head of World Zionist Organization, will be here in the next couple of weeks. You'll have some postcards coming in the next couple of days as well. Yeah, no, we are definitely on that for sure. Yeah. Joel?
You're concerned about kids, should they say I'm Jewish, should they acknowledge that part going into college? Absolutely.
No, that's what I said. That was my answer. And if you don't want to say that, then maybe that's not the spot for you to go. Yep.
You down, that becomes part of your story.
Absolutely.
And you should be somewhere else anyway.
Right.
The next thing I want to say is, or ask your feeling, both of you, is do you feel the Jewish community, especially here in Los Angeles, do you feel that we're all kind of feeling insulated, protected, and not really standing up and maybe doing what we should be doing?
I don't feel that we're insulated. I feel that we're, when you say insulated, what do you mean by that actually?
Maybe we don't feel more protected maybe than we should.
So I was,
Because we're so surrounded by like kind.
the example that I give was last Hanukkah when President Biden was here and down the street in Holmby Park, there were major protests saying Genocide Joe. And it was that Friday night that was Hanukkah. And instead of lighting our candles, doing Pirsumei Nisa, publicizing the miracle, we closed our curtains and our kids asked, why are you doing that? And because there were vicious posters coming out of cars on the streets. And that night, I had security walk me home from a Flesh Family or Orden Family Friday Night Live. At that point, I realized this is not insular. Again, I feel safe in my community, but realizing that, and I remember going online and finding people were saying, I'm not going to tell the Instagram handle that it was, but go park down the street. It's sort of the whole mask ban type of thing right now. Go park down the street so they don't see you, blah, 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 blah. And I realized like, whoa, this is happening here.
Right.
Yeah.
were there. There was a big thing up at UCLA.
Yeah.
Where then they brought in the stage, the music.
Yep, so we were there on that Sunday.
People were coming out from the encampment, the Palestinian encampment, and a lot of the Jewish people there turned to protect what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of pushing, shoving, whatnot, but I was proud to be there, and I was proud to push back.
Yep.
To say, like, we're not just here for you to walk through.
So I think that you're correct in that it's a false sense of security, a false sense of insulation. And we do have strength in numbers here in Los Angeles, and we do have strength of numbers in New York. And that's not going to last forever if this continues. Because, my family's been tethered to Los Angeles for, several decades. And we made Aliyah from Chicago to Los Angeles because we're making Aliyah on stages all across. But that's not to say that my parents followed us out to Los Angeles, that we wouldn't follow our kids to wherever it is that they decide to live. And so I think this really is a case where, I talk about in the book that the secret that we don't like to talk about as Jews is that every diaspora comes to an end. The question is this one coming to an end? And I argue that it's not, because I believe in the American promise of self-correction. Sometimes America doesn't correct, it overcorrects. It overcorrects. It's a pendulum, exactly. So we force the swing and then it swings a little bit too far. But I have to believe in the values of this country and the values that my grandparents took so much pride in arriving and becoming part of this country. They could not fathom what is happening right now on college campuses. They couldn't fathom it. Were they alive? And I can't fathom it. I am alive. I just know that I think that the fear is over in the sense that I don't think I'm alone anymore. I know that we're not alone. The question is, are we being hung out to dry here in Los Angeles? Is the Jewish community not protected here in Los Angeles? Because if we're not protected, we all have to understand we're not protected by choice, right? We're not protected by choice. Just like if Jews are not protected in New York, they're not protected by choice. I was just in a city in Miami where you drive down the street and strip mall after strip mall has Israeli flags hanging in the window. And so when you say to yourself, well, why is it that there's not a single person walking around in Miami trying to tear those flags down or the posters or anything else that's up there? Because that city makes a choice. That city also makes a choice. So there are cities from which we can learn what that protection would look like. But I have to tell you that in Los Angeles and New York, oftentimes we're our worst enemies. We're our worst enemies because leaders in the community say, I just had a meeting with a rabbi who told me that there's no reason to have police officers during a pogrom on Pico Boulevard. But the rabbi that they're meeting with is not Rabbi Sherman or Rabbi Lebovitz. They're meeting with the rabbi of their choosing that gives them an answer that they want to get. And so this is the problem when you're in a giant urban setting filled with, all kinds of minorities, which is the blessing of a city like this. It also becomes the difficult part to move the needle in any way. And we just need to become more astute, better developed in terms of how it is that we're going to carry that message across. Correct.
Harmonious, but maybe that's not always the case.
Correct.
We'll do one last question, or let's ask the three, and then we'll, so 1, 2, and 3. Michael, Frank, go ahead.
Discussion. I look forward to reading your book. You talk quite a bit about the problem. What's the answer to the 20 to 35 group? Is it teaching that group ritual Judaism and being in Israel at the end of January? Hey, most folks are secular. Is it just building the love of Israel without ritual, but having the Sabbath? I mean, what's the answer? Your children are young,
Right.
How do you do it?
So what's the answer, Frank?
Yeah, so my question is about the extreme divisions in the Jewish community in Israel and the US, and referring back, of course, pre-October 7th, what was going on in the streets of Israel, big issue about the rule of law and the courts in Israel, and we have demonization in this country from the left and the right, not mentioning names, towards Jews who are liberal are demonized, Jews who are conservative or pro-Trump are demonized. And I'm wondering, what is your suggestions about that? I think your thesis is great. And I think it is kind of centrist, which we need to try to unify and bring, even within our community, bring it together. But
Imagine that,
I think
conservative
really
rabbis, a centrist,
serious
yeah.
problems
Yeah.
around the world with this.
Correct.
And last question.
Yes. Well, I'm encouraged by your optimism. I want to go back as well to follow up your point and the one you made earlier about the 18 to 35-year-old cohort. I had the somewhat painful experience of reading a book this past week by Joshua Lightfoot called Tablet Shattered, where he makes, I guess, what could be a counterpoint.
Correct.
You're saying, in other words, that Zionism and Americanism are dying, if not already collapsed, in that generation, our community's generation. Do you agree that it's that prevalent? And I guess to follow what everybody else is asking, how do we meet that challenge if it is?
So what's the answer? Polarization, and then sort of the same thing. My answer is what Rabbi Wolpe told me once. Everybody's a conservative Jew. They just don't know it yet.
That's right. So I'll start with the Maneker question first, okay? That is, I think the Israel situation, the political situation, the American political situation is the same solution. It's actually, most countries in the world right now have such vitriolic partisanship that the middle has eroded. And that's a problem for everybody, especially conservative rabbis. So we feel it because, you know, any kiddush could just explode after services because somebody says something and two people disagree, and the disagreement becomes a reason that people never want to come back to shul ever again.
That's why we don't have lunch here.
I understand. You could leave services at Sinai, come to VBS, and lunch is still going on. So the answer really for both is a kind of realization that the middle is crucial for a society to thrive. Compromise is crucial for a society to thrive, and that if 50% of the population thinks anything, they have a good point. We have to be open to the idea that if 50% of any group thinks anything, whether it be 49.9 or 50.1, 51.1, whatever it is, they have a point that we need to consider and internalize in some way. Okay, that's not saying that even 60% or 65%, the other group doesn't even internalize those points anymore. They just become louder. We become louder rather than engaging. So that's a long-term fix for both countries and many other countries in the world. And there's lots of, if you read, what's his name, Jonathan Haidt, or if you read all of these different authors, social media is playing a large role in riling people up, constantly riling people up, and that's the way that we enjoy. We're addicted at this point to being riled up on a daily basis, rather than being soothed by kind of these older, moderate voices that used to put us to bed in the evening news and tell us that we were going to be okay. Now we just get riled up on our telephone, on our iPhone, right before going to bed. The last video I watch is something on YouTube or Instagram or whatever it is. Before I close my eyes, the first thing I watch is something on I-24 on my iPhone, and so I go to bed aggravated and I wake up aggravated, and so there's as a Jewish man that's getting older, most of my disposition is aggravation to begin with. So it's like it's hard. It's really, really hard. Okay, so the whole world. This is a problem for the whole world. It's not just a problem unique to us. It's not a problem unique to Israel, and I think that's going to take time for all of us to realize that this is not a good path forward. It's not a good path forward.
Especially bad for Jews.
It's always bad for Jews. That's right.
It's just not going to be good for the Jews.
Right.
That's my opinion.
Right. And because we have to choose between these two, and if you have to choose like that, it's not a good choice. It's not a good way to live for Jews, right? To compromise one of these. All right. So I talk about that a lot in the book in terms of what the compromise is. So we need a kind of global answer. All right. The most difficult question is, what do we do about this? At the very end of the book, I talk about it for a very short period of time, what we do about it. What we do about it is we prioritize Judaism in Israel in a way that we haven't before. Okay, so Sinai Temple has a lot of wonderful, wonderful families here, wonderful families. VBS has a lot of wonderful families. Many times those families are even related to each other, right? There's a lot of crossover. And so I've heard a lot of the same stories. So I'm not casting aspersion on one community or the other. I'm not trying to make fun of anybody here. But sometimes somebody will come to me and say, Rabbi, the Israel trip that the synagogue is putting on is too expensive. And it doesn't coincide with our dates because we're taking our family to London and Paris. And then I know that we're not talking about expensive. Right? We're not talking about expensive suddenly. We're talking about prioritization and choosing. Okay? I'll give you another example of a story that often comes to me, and I know this wouldn't happen at Sinai Temple, it only happens at VBS, but sometimes a parent will come and say, Rabbi, the B'nai Mitzvah training happens on Tuesday afternoon, and Joey has soccer on Tuesday afternoon, and Joey is really good at his, 9-year-old, 10-year-old soccer. And I say to them all the time, right, how often do you go to Joey's soccer games? They say, every week, I never miss it. It's very important to support him. And I said, how many times have you ever come to the B'nai Mitzvah training? Never. Why would I do that? We drop them off at the synagogue. Well, Joey internalizes that soccer matters to you and B'nai Mitzvah does not, right? So the way that we spend our time as adults and our resources, our kids will, by the way that we expend those important resources of time and money, our kids internalize what's important in their lives. So that comes down to traveling to Israel. That comes down to Jewish education, learning Hebrew, right? Hebrew is the only language you can study for 40 years and still not be fluent, okay? I'm amazed when I meet kids that go to public school, take 2 years of Spanish, and they're standing in Baja Fresh and ordering off the menu, right? And I stand in a restaurant in Tel Aviv and forget the word for spoon. And I've been taking Hebrew my entire life. So here we are, we're at this weird place where we're desperately trying to teach and to reinvent the wheel over and over and over again. And we know that it's about prioritization of what's important. Because somehow kids that went to religious school for 3-4 days a week, kids who were sent on extensive Israel experiences like I was growing up as opposed to 1-week birthright trips, they seem to lock in a much more impactful way, getting to the ultimate question, what do we do about this problematic generation of 20 to 35? The most honest answer is, I don't know yet. I don't know yet. I don't know if there's going to be a response that's going to be a singular silver bullet for what to do from this 20 to 35. But parents hate when I say this, especially when they have kids in this age range. But parents love what I'm about to say who have kids in the younger age range. I don't think it'll happen again. I don't think it's going to happen again. I think that a new generation of rabbis is rising. I think a new generation of parents is rising. I think a new generation of educators are rising. I think we all recognize that we missed the mark by a mile. And the question is, not every kid missed the mark by a mile, not every kid missed the mark by a mile, but there are some kids that failed to grasp the essence of our peoplehood and what binds us as a tribal tradition before they ventured out to say, I'm going to save the world as well. They could save the world all they want. If we end up disintegrating in terms of a people, they're going to be in trouble, whether they realize it or not, right? That's why we invite the wicked child to the Passover Seder, so they realize they're part of the Seder. They realize that this journey is their journey, and whether or not that wicked child is impacted by the Seder, we never know. We never know. The Haggadah doesn't tell us. And then the wicked child stood up and said, "You're right." So we just keep trying year after year after year to drive the points home, to affect those kids the best that we can. And we pivot with the younger generation, and we try to change our way.
By the wicked son. We want to thank Rabbi Lebovitz for his intellect, his wisdom, and honestly, the courage to say we just don't know yet, but we have to try. And so we're going to try, and we're on the path together. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening. Shabbat Shalom. If we don't see you before Pesach, which we hope you do, Chag Kasher v'Sameach.
Thank you, Rabbi Sherman, and thank you, all of you